Hi everyone, Anthony on Power Rangers Lost Galaxy fan film with a brand new episode of the Terra Adventure podcast, bringing you episode 342, presented by my Morphin Megaverse Power Rangers Facebook group. As promised from the previous night, less than 24 hours ago, I did said that I was going to do a video talking about why did the Power Rangers Turbo movie fail at the box office. So, for those who didn't get the memo, that over the years, Power Rangers have had movies, and with 3 of them being released that have been released throughout the in theaters over the course of 25 years. Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, the movie from 1995, this from 1997, and the 2017 movie in 2017. Every single one of the 3 Power Ranger movies, the ones that stood out the most financially and in terms of what was the highest grossing Power Rangers film to date, it would have to be the Mighty Morphin film, but I do know that it didn't really break even enough. But yeah, 69 million worldwide was pretty much enough for MMPR in its movie to be, considerably successful. But then you go into the second Power Rangers movie that was released. Again, that being Turbo, a Power Rangers movie. So I do have some facts or certain reasonings why did the movie underperform at the box office when it was originally released on March the 28th of 1997. And, I have a lot to say about Turbo's box office failings because there is some things that it's uncharted for me to bring up because I hardly ever talk about box office or talk about, how much money this movie made at the box office or how much this movie made at the box office or how much money that this movie lost at the box office or how much money this movie did not have at the box office, when it opened on opening weekend or so. That's a lot to talk about because I'm not really much of a box office mojo kind of person or a box office analyst in terms of how much money this movie has grossed and so I'm not that kind of person. But I do know for a fact there has to be a few factors, like 3 or 4 factors why Turbo, a Power Rangers movie, did not do well when it was originally released in March of 97, which was 3 weeks at the bare minimum until the premiere of Power Rangers Turbo when it aired in April of 1997 until it lasted until November of 1997 on Fox. Okay, so there's some things I have to bring up why it didn't do good. I would say that would have to be the fact that, again, like I said last video talking about the movie, was that it was 1997. A lot of kids back then were jumping off Power Rangers and pursuing other interests at that time. And when I was 4.5 going on 5 years old in 1997 when this thing came out, and before we entered the summer of Batman and Robin, but you know how that movie did miserably, ended up having a reputation as being one of the worst superhero movies of all time, if not one of the worst Batman movies of all time. There has to be something in consideration to be said in terms of the Power Rangers Turbo movie. What was the environment at the time? What was the competition? What movies were playing at the time of the Power Rangers Turbo movie? And what movies actually succeeded it at the box office versus any other films that were out at the time? Well, considerably, you should know that between the months of January through March of every annual year you go to the cinema, usually a lot of movies that come out between January, February, and March, especially back in them days, that, especially in the days when this movie came out, that if you go to a movie in January, February, or March of any given year, but this was back in the time there wasn't that many movies, well, especially from what I said back when I did do a video long ago on the Terra Venture podcast talking about the release date for the 2017 Power Rangers movie being pushed back from July 2016 to January 2017 until they decided to put it out around March of 2017. That usually when you put out a movie as something like a Power Rangers movie in January or March, the movie would bomb. So chances were the movie would not be successful if you put it out during that period, because January through March is considered Hollywood's dump month season of movies that will either make it or break it at the box office. If it has some good word of mouth, bad word of mouth. Usually a lot of movies that come out between this era, you know, especially before now with movies like the Lego Batman movie or Deadpool or Black Panther, but those are superhero movies that have came out in recent memory in recent years. But in a time before we had any of those films like Deadpool and Lego Batman. But if you go back 25 years ago in 1997, starting with 1997 or even long before that, but especially around during like my time of being in this world now, that if you go back to when Turbo, a Power Rangers movie, did come out, there were some movies that came out in March, like around the tail end of the month of 97, and then you go into April of 1997, and I'll give you some of the titles of movies that came out during either the week of Turbo, a Power Rangers movie, or movies that came out 2 weeks afterwards that have either succeeded Turbo or did not succeed Turbo when the movie launched. But we know for a fact that the movie was sitting at number 7 at the box office on its opening weekend of March the 28th. And you can tell that right there, right in your face and right from the bat, the movie was doomed to suck at the box office, like really bad. And not only that, to top it off, the first thing to bring up is Turbo, a Power Rangers movie, you know, Power Rangers in general, was marketed as a kids movie, and it's a live action kids movie. I mean, it's not Disney, it's not a Warner Brothers animated feature, and even back in the time when Warner Brothers was putting out some animated features that didn't do so good, given that, you know, Warner Brothers and some others were off to the races trying to go toe-to-toe with Disney during that time. Not only that, Disney was, at this time when Turbo Power Rangers movie was coming out, was already out, Disney was a few months away from releasing their next animated feature of the Disney Renaissance era, which was Hercules. And then some months later with a few live action films like Jungle the Jungle with Tim Allen, and of course George of the Jungle with Brendan Fraser, based on the George of the Jungle cartoon series from the 60s, which I did saw. I used to have George of the Jungle on VHS. And some other films they had out in 1997 during the spring, late spring, early summer months. You know, you had hit tentpole films like Con Air and Men in Black that dominated the summer of 1997. But specifically during the spring, you know, the March and April, early May part of, you know, a tentpole season. And, you know, again, Turbo Power Rangers movie was a kids movie, and not only that, it was a Power Rangers movie, and let alone this was the last time Power Rangers would ever have another feature film until, again, the 2017 film, which also underperformed at the box office. But compared to this Power Rangers film, the 2017 film, despite, you know, as much as I'm still irritated with the amount of favorability as to why everybody likes that movie so much for many things, but the Turbo movie did not do so well critically, and yeah, the word of mouth was really bad, because at that time, Power Rangers Mania, as I dub it, between 1993 to 1997, well, again, Power Rangers was popular during its Mighty Morphin days, and it was also in the same environment and zeitgeist that, you know, again, like I said before, a lot of kids older than me were growing out of the franchise, and, you know, when Turbo started airing in April of 97 on Fox Kids, and then throughout the first 19 episodes of Turbo, when they swap out Tommy's team and them. You know, a lot of kids have stopped watching the show by this point, and there have been some of those kids that I heard that are now adults, like around my age and stuff, that watched the show up until Power Rangers in Space and never looked back since. Not only that, it was also a time where, again, Power Rangers was not as popular as it once was anymore. So gotta remember that was the time and the time frame and the environment with Power Rangers then and likely today. The movie opened, earned a 9 million opening weekend, but it ranked at number 7 at the domestic box office. So at the end of its run, it only earned overall 8 million in North America and only 1.3 million overseas for a worldwide total of 9.6. So why was Turbo Power Rangers movie a box office bomb? And why was it such a failure, and which caused Power Rangers to not have another movie in 20 years until the more recent movie we had 5 years ago? I have to think there has to be some movies that came out that were big names at the time, movies that other people wanted to see, that were, and especially some movies that were probably shit themselves. And thinking about there were at least 2 movies that came out the same day as Turbo, a Power Rangers movie, and both of them were also box office bombs as well. And Turbo Turbo was the biggest bomb that weekend it opened. There were 2 movies that came out alongside Turbo Power Rangers movie, and they all 3 of these movies, Turbo included, were also universally negative. The first, you had The Sixth Man with Marlon Wayans, this sports comedy film about, it's a satire of the NCAA, it's that college basketball league, where one of the players that Marlon Wayans played in that film had died, and he would be a ghost to his friend when he was still alive movie. Yeah, that movie was also a bust at the box office the same day as Turbo. Then you also had this movie called Baps, which starred Halle Berry. Back, which was a female buddy comedy film that opened the same day as the Power Rangers Turbo movie and that Marlon Wayans film. Yeah, Baps also underperformed at the box office really bad. And I just wonder what movies actually dominated, but specifically we're talking about Power Rangers. Like, why did the Power Rangers Turbo movie underperform, like, really bad? Yeah, Baps and Six Man bombed, but what big profile movies or smaller known movies did a little better than the Power Rangers Turbo movie when it came out? Okay, so I'm going to give you a few of those movies. I believe you have that movie Selena with Jennifer Lopez, that biopic film about the Latina singer Selena Perez, before she was murdered at age 23. That movie had a good word of mouth, and it did somewhat okay at the box office. But again, it's a biopic movie, and although that movie actually did surpass its, Selena surpassed its box office, budget off with its box office grossing about $35 million off its $20 million budget. So Selena was one movie that actually did fine when, when Power Rangers was about to open and then it played. And then there was another film. You had this non-Disney animated feature that Warner Brothers Animation did, Cats Don't Dance. Cats Don't Dance, while the film, that movie was a box office bomb too, but it did have somewhat a good word of mouth, but it just didn't break even to beat Power Rangers in its run, because not only that, Cats Don't Dance came out like 2 days before Power Rangers, and that movie Wednesday, March the 26th was on a Wednesday when Cats Don't Dance came out. So it just, it barely didn't even make it past Power Rangers record, because Cats Don't Dance, its box office gross was $3.6 million worldwide. And then you had this movie with a huge ensemble starring Harrison Ford, Brad Pitt, this movie called The Devil's Own. It was a film distributed by Sony. This action thriller featuring Harrison Ford and Matt Damon, Brad Pitt, Julia Stiles, and all them people in that film. And The Devil's Own, okay, what was its box office gross? Now that movie was also sort of a box office flop also. No, actually, The Devil's Own actually grossed about $140 million off its $86 million budget. Something that, Power Rangers couldn't break even over what budget it had back then. So yeah, that Harrison Ford movie, The Devil's Own, made more money than Turbo Power Rangers movie, even in its like second, third week, and onward until it finished its run. I can't think of some other big movies that were like even some of the re-release movies of classic movies that were out before my time that I know are considered some of the greatest movies of all time, like The Godfather being re-released in March of 1997, and also the re-releases of the original Star Wars trilogy at the time. And by that time, Return of the Jedi was being re-released in theaters for with the special edition, hoping it can give that movie more money than its original run back in 1983 with Star Wars Return of the Jedi at the time. Okay, then you also had this okay, speaking of Disney, you had that Tim Allen movie that he did with Disney called Jungle to Jungle. While that movie had somewhat a bad word of mouth, the movie did okay at the box office, but critics hated the film. But it did okay, whopping in $59 million off its $30-some million budget. But it probably didn't break even for Disney. So, but again, that was when Tim Allen was, where he was in his career with that movie. Okay, then you go into April for some big movies. You had some big name movies that came out in April, in the weeks after Turbo Power Rangers movie came out. Now, bear in mind, this is going to be a shocker. That Val Kilmer movie, The Saint. You want to know how much money that movie made at the box office on like the on the week after Turbo Power Rangers movie premiered? The Saint, starring Val Kilmer and Elizabeth Shue, with a $60 million budget, that movie grossed when it opened and also overall worldwide $169 million, something that Turbo Power Rangers movie failed to do. But although The Saint opened at number 2 on its opening weekend, earning about $16 million, but overall the worldwide gross would be $169 million. So The Saint was, it was a good, it made some good numbers when it came out. While the reviews were mixed to negative, but that movie did okay financially, otherwise at the box office. I'm trying to think of some other films that came out in April that probably made more than Turbo Power Rangers movie, even in the weeks after. But by that point, the movie had already left the theater. Now, believe it or not, another movie that was also around the number 7 box office slot is Turbo Power Rangers film. And believe it or not, that movie was directed by none other, the McHale's Navy movie, based on the television show from the 1960s, directed by yours truly, from the guy who directed the first Mighty Morphin Power Rangers film, Brian Spicer, of all people. That movie also bombed at the box office, but that movie probably, the movie didn't make as close enough as compared to the box office gross. It was in the same spot as the Power Rangers Turbo movie at the box office. So again, I think 1997 was looking pretty bleak for a lot of films, and in general, especially like the first chunk of the year for certain films. A lot of movies that came out between January to April of 1997, you had a few hits, but every other movie that came out in 1997 between January through April, with Turbo Power Rangers movie sandwiched in between a lot of these flops. Like, only two or three of those films made more money than Power Rangers Turbo did. Selena, The Saint, and The Devil's Own. And I don't know. Yeah, those are like the only three movies I can think of that made more money. So you have that. So that's one factor, because to be honest though, there was no competition for Turbo Power Rangers film. My next tangent about the film as to why the movie failed at the box office, and I've said this again, it has to do with the fact that in the zeitgeist that we were in with Power Rangers as a franchise at the time, everybody, okay, from a Power Rangers perspective, that while the franchise was no longer Mighty Morphin anymore, Power Rangers was starting to lose its tune in terms of, the changes with the costumes and stuff, but you still had your fan favorites of Tommy and Adam and them still up until mid-Turbo. With the show, but with the movie though, the movie just didn't perform as well, because again, the movie came out in a time where we had like a lot of bombs, a lot during January through April of 1997. And a few movies that came out at the time, again, three of those movies I mentioned, that Val Kilmer movie, The Saint, The Devil's Own with Brad Pitt and Harrison Ford, the Selena biopic with Jennifer Lopez. Those three movies did well. But even if some of those movies had some bad word of mouth, but they still made money. But they actually, but again, not only that, parents, if you had any parents around at the time that, where you had to drag your parents to see this movie, if you were still into Power Rangers, for those out there, back then, I think the facade of Power Rangers was dying out, because I guess maybe it's because Turbo was not going to be Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie 2 or anything, given that we've already long at this point in Power Rangers history long moved past Mighty Morphin and onto Zeo, then Turbo. But by this point, a lot of people I just brought up, that I've came across in the fandom, have stated that they stopped watching Power Rangers when Turbo happened, or before Turbo started, or some have still watched up until when Tommy and them left during Turbo, and stuff like that. So yeah, I can see the pain from that, and why even the movie was bad. But I think it's because simply the movie looked like, even from the trailers, it looked like it should have been a direct-to-video special setting up Power Rangers Turbo, which is the 5th season of Power Rangers. And I think that they should have probably put out the movie a little early, put the movie out, like I said back in my last video. Now, onto that tangent though, I think what it was, one of the biggest mistakes from Saban's behalf, because like I said, Saban had a contract with Fox to do another Power Rangers movie, whether if it was Mighty Morphin related or not, because again, Mighty Morphin is still an iconic name. When most people associate Power Rangers, it's always Mighty Morphin. But since the movie was called Turbo, a Power Rangers movie, not Mighty Morphin Power Rangers going turbo or something, or Mighty Morphin Power Rangers 2 or something, then yeah, that's probably why the movie didn't do well. And again, as much as I mind Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie for what it was at the time when I was growing up, but now it just feels like what they did is what they did at the time. So, but again, not only that, you know, a lot of parents back in the days of the Ranger Mania that we all lived in during the 90s up until Power Rangers Turbo's time in 1997, you can tell that the writing was on the wall. Power Rangers was just not as popular anymore at that time. Again, given the environment and the atmosphere of 1997, the mid to late 90s at the time, for Power Rangers, because a lot of kids were mostly into other things. You know, big kids, you know, the bigger kids that were much older than me back then when I was 4 or 5 years old in 1997. And, you know, they were on to something like Pokemon and whatever at the time. So, again, Power Rangers was phasing out. It was dying out. And not only that, you know, again, that's one of the reasons why you look, when you see, or whenever I come across anybody who, you know, when I see any Power Ranger stuff in stores at like Walmart or Target or GameStop nowadays, you know, compared to when I was younger, when I didn't know about GameStop or Walmart yet, back in the 90s. But the thing was, you know, when I do, as a grown-ass man now, seeing a lot of Power Ranger stuff, you have Mighty Morphin stuff everywhere for like the Lightning collection, even back when we had Bandai and their legacy toys and stuff, and, you know, even back when we still had Toys R Us still. I mean, 1997, Toys R Us was still a thing. So, you know, if you go to the toys store and find some Power Ranger stuff, you're mostly going to see stuff for what was concurrently with Power Rangers Turbo at the time. But, you know, they would come back to the Mighty Morphin stuff, come with that Power Playback toy line. But that was, like, again, during Lost Galaxy's run of Power Rangers with that Power Playback thing of re-releasing old Mighty Morphin toys. And, you know, again, kids' interest in Power Rangers was down anyway at this point. I think the failure of the movie at the box office was probably contributed by the fact that kids back then were not into Power Rangers anymore at this point. That would probably result to the reason, one of the few reasons I give it, that, you know, Power Rangers was just not was just not interesting to them, to those kids anymore. But for me at the time, it made sense. I was still part of that 2 to 5 demographic of little kids at the time. I mean, it still appealed to me when I was that age, but, you know, up until Power Rangers in Space, when I was 5 going on 6 in 1998. But we didn't have a Power Rangers movie then because, again, Turbo bombed, and I knew then and there the reason why this movie bombed, and I think the financial failure of the film is one of, like I said again, and I know I sound like I'm going to repeat myself saying this, was one of the benefactors as to why Power Rangers had not had another feature film in 2 decades. And then when we had later on, and then when we do get to the, you know, 2017 Power Rangers movie 20 years later in 2017, that movie too bombed bad, and that sucks, you know, because I just wish that they probably should have did something different. Now, speaking of that, you know, like I said in the last video from last night, if the movie had performed differently, well, the movie kind of made its money back with home video releases years later on, like, you know, especially, like, well, first the VHS, then the DVD a few years later. And then Blu-ray recently from Shout Factory. So not a lot of movies. So basically Turbo Power Rangers movie, well, again, the movie was a bust here in America, but however, it had garnered a cult following over at the UK. But unfortunately, you know, yeah, that's what I got from this, because, you know, the movie just, you know, if the movie had been released as a, like I said last time, if it was released as a made for, you know, TV movie event on Fox Kids, the same time Power Rangers was still on Fox Kids, you know, it would have been great. Or they should have probably broke this movie into 3 parts instead of the 3-part shift in the Turbo premiere episodes we had for Turbo when the season was airing on Fox. I think, or they should have made this as a direct-to-video feature. Instead, well, 20th Century Fox would have basically would just distribute the home video thing under their 20th Century Fox Home Entertainment banner. And it would still be a Power Rangers thing, but it would be a direct-to-video thing, but even if you may not get anything out of it. And I think the biggest mistake was Saban should have released the film in theaters. That's what I got, because they should have released it on home video, the save face, because you don't want a big bomb on your hands with the Power Ranger brand, and you don't want the movie have a huge, it already has a big, blood stain of box office bomb written all over this movie, or a big shit stain on a big dog shit stain that says box office bomb with this movie on it. So that's probably why the movie didn't do good. But if Turbo Power Rangers movie was released in home video format instead of releasing it in theaters on March the 28th, or release it on TV as a made-for-TV movie event via Fox Kids, that's different. But then you have to cut some stuff out from what was in this movie for television if you're going to broadcast it for the very first time to us. But again, the option was to release it in theaters, but the end result was it would bomb miserably at the box office, and so there you go. But 25 years later, after the movie came out, it's one of those Power Ranger movies that we all want to forget about. But again, if this movie did better, I just think personally 1997 overall was just not a great year for cinema, except for a few movies. Even if you have your Men in Blacks or George of the Jungles or Con Airs or Titanics out there, but or that Val Kilmer movie, Saints out there. So you know what I mean. Or that Keanu Reeves movie, The Devil's Advocate, with your devil advocates out there and stuff. So, Turbo Power Rangers movie should have been released as a direct-to-video feature event for us to get hyped up for Power Rangers Turbo, even if you hate the season, even 25 years later. Or, like I said, made for a TV movie event. But, if the movie had done differently right then and there, instead of releasing it in the cinemas just to bomb miserably, and knowing in fact Power Rangers fad status with kids was done and over with at this point, damn well they should have never released it in theaters. That's probably why we haven't had another Power Rangers movie in theaters until, again, the 2017 film, and even when that movie bombed, and now that, again... if they re-released the movie in theaters just for like a one-night only event celebrating the anniversary, for like a cult following, to try to boost interest in a cult following. But I know this movie will never have a cult following here in the States, because given that, there is a lot of us in the Power Rangers fandom that hates Turbo as a season. But yeah, I can understand why. But if for the fact that Mighty Morphin will always be more celebrated than this movie, or the 2017 movie to a degree, but mostly this movie. But I just think that the movie just came out on a really bad time. It just feels like they really should have never released the movie in theaters, knowing it was not going to make money at the box office. It was not going to be a big box office smash like the first Mighty Morphin Power Rangers film, because at that time, there were a lot of kids back in the 90s that were aging out of childhood and onto like being teenagers and stuff at the time. All those kids that were into only Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, but did watch a little bit of Zeo and a little bit of this here and there. But I just think at this point, that's probably one of the few factors I can give why the movie bombed. But yeah, it was just a really bad time, folks. It was a really bad time for this movie to come out. I wish that if it had done better on home video to save face and gave Saban more money on home video, yeah, but the critical reception would still be the same, negative reviews and all, and whatnot. So yeah, that's what I'll give it. So those are my thoughts on why the Power Rangers Turbo movie bombed at the box office, and those are my thoughts.